Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Everything Vaguely Paranormal. I'm Shelley Pruitt, and my partners in the paranormal, Mr. Blake Smith and Mr. Ryan Roberts, are here tonight. How are you guys?
Wunderbar.
Wunderbar.
Wunderbar. That's
Yeah.
good. I don't know what
Yeah.
that means, but that's cool. I'm
Wonderful
guessing
in
it
German.
means you're good.
It means that's why our overseas people don't like us.
Oh, okay. To all of our German friends, I was not part of that. So tonight, you guys, we have got a really intense and potentially triggering episode. We're going to be talking about the Madman of Waco, David Koresh, cult leader. Wow, I don't even know what to say about this. I have been writing up on this one until literally about 7 minutes ago when I retyped something.
11th hour.
Yeah.
I always do. And I will tell you guys, I had this at almost 100 pages, and you're welcome. I trimmed it down to about 34. So we shall get started. We'll get started talking about David Koresh. And do you guys know a little bit about Mr. Koresh?
Oh,
anything?
Yeah. Actually, so the Waco Siege is the first actual news event I remember watching on television. I remember being in the den at my grandparents' house and watching the compound burn to the ground. And it's something that I've always been interested in. And it's something like I need to go out and check out the spot here in Texas. And ever since I've been in Texas, weirdly enough, I've never been out there to check it out. But I'm super excited to sink my teeth into this subject tonight.
I see a field trip in our future.
As long as we get to take equipment.
There you go. There you go. Hey, there's lots of crap that'll fit in my purse.
Okay.
So,
That's what she said.
don't start like that. So let's go ahead and let's jump in and let's get started on Mr. David Koresh. So I'm going to give you the warning first off. This might be triggering for some people. And like any topic that covers religion, there are always different belief systems involved. So I'm going to ask that you be respectful in your comments, and let's discuss the science of, of cults without condemning religious belief systems. And even though we are discussing religious cults, people's belief systems are sacred to them. So please get comments and questions within the scope of the man, David Koresh, and the events that led up to the tragedy that occurred. Also, there is triggering language in this episode. We don't sanitize history because it makes people uncomfortable. That doesn't do justice to the story or to the people involved. So we're going to tell it, or I'm going to tell it as it happened. So There's your warning.
Fair enough.
Turn it off now if you don't want to be part of that.
Okay.
So here we go. So when looking at David Koresh, you have to wonder, how did this self-proclaimed prophet rise to the level of a cult leader in a religious fringe group? How did this rock and roll drifter guy with a God complex rise to prominence with his apocalyptic preachings? And how did he put into motion the longest standoff in American law enforcement history? Well, it all starts with a little boy named Vernon Wayne Howell. And he was born on August 17th of 1959 in Houston, Texas, to a 14-year-old unwed mother named Bonnie Sue Clark. The baby's father, Bobby Howell, ran off shortly after little Vernon was born. But Bonnie quickly moved on, and she married a violent alcoholic fresh out of prison. He was a miserable man who often beat Bonnie and his infant stepson, Vernon. And somewhere between the age of 18 months and 2 years, Vernon was left in the care of his grandparents, Erline and Vernon Lee Clark. Now, Bonnie, she took off and moved to Dallas without her child. And the Clarks did the best they could with Vernon. I mean, that was their grandchild, but they were also raising other children, their children. So he grew up with the younger Clark children who were more like his siblings than his aunts and uncles. And he even got to the point where he called Erline Mama. And Erline was very impressed with this little boy, with his thirst for knowledge, and he liked to take things apart just to see what was inside. He loved to tinker, and he was very mechanically inclined, even from this very young age. And she even nicknamed him Sputnik. Don't know why, that's just what she called him.
I was nicknamed Worm. There you go. Random knowledge for you right there.
But whenever Vernon was 5, Bonnie Sue returned to East Texas with a different husband than she left with. She had quickly met and married a man in 1964 named Roy Rocky Haldeman. He was a union carpenter who owned a lounge, which was alleged to be a front for prostitution. So you see, her picker really doesn't work too good, I don't think.
Mm.
Anyway, they had come to take Vernon home with them and back to Dallas. And in 1966, they had a son of their own named Roger. Now, little Vernon, he didn't adjust well to the change. He never really felt like he was wanted or that he belonged in the family. And when the Clarks would come to visit, little Vernon would cry and beg to be taken back home with Mama. That just breaks my heart. So, as Vernon grew, he was a lanky, awkward kid. He had a slight stutter and thick glasses, and he was growing up in this rough neighborhood in Dallas. He hated school and he had a difficult time making friends. Even though he was very smart and inquisitive, he had an undiagnosed condition of dyslexia. So it didn't help that he was held back to repeat the first grade. And when he was 8 years old, he was allegedly cornered and sexually assaulted in a barn by a group of teenage boys.
Oh, God.
He was traumatized and he became withdrawn and unable to keep pace with his classmates due to his dyslexia. In the third and fourth grade, he was put into special education classes. And the other children teased him mercilessly and gave him the nickname of Mr. Retardo. And this
poor kid.
infuriated Vernon. He was not dumb. And he was, in fact, far smarter than those children who teased him. But as he turned 12, he decided he would turn his attention to the things that he was good at. He was good at music, mechanics, and religion. He wasn't that kid that ran around during church services. He sat and listened intently, impressed by the man on the stage who was preaching. He studied the Bible and he memorized it section by section. And he taught himself to play the guitar and he strummed along with the music on the radio, Christian radio stations and pop radio stations. And he loved to tinker and take things apart and put them back together. And like most Texas kids, he had been exposed to guns at an early age and taught how to handle them. And he loved to hunt and target practice and shoot tin cans off of a fence post. And by 14, even though he didn't like to read, he had memorized the entire Old Testament of the Bible and could recite any passage of it from memory.
I ain't gonna lie, that's impressive.
Yeah.
That is impressive.
Yeah.
That's very impressive. But school continued to be a problem for him. So much of a problem that everyone agreed that he should probably go to school somewhere else. That includes the faculty, the parents, the teachers, everyone, including the principal. So he moved back to live with his grandparents in Tyler, Texas. And he was supposed to share a room with his younger uncle / brother. But Vernon saw this little shabby shed outside. Excuse me. And decided that he would like to live out there. He did all the handiwork necessary to make it his own little place. He'd spend hours out there teaching himself the guitar. And he, a man with a guitar is going to get noticed by the ladies. And the neighborhood girls started to pay attention. Free from the stigma of being the Dallas school pariah, he could be himself. And he had grown into a good-looking rocker kid. And people in Tyler actually liked him. He was insightful, persuasive, and this was one of the bright spots in his otherwise bleak childhood. He was learning to be Vernon. But these moments of happiness were short-lived. And at 16, his grandfather decided that he was done with Vernon, and he shipped him back to Dallas to live with Bonnie and Roy. Well, since public school wasn't an option, and because Vernon had shown an interest in the Bible, Bonnie and Erline decided to enroll him in a private school, the Dallas Junior Academy, which was run by the Seventh-day Adventist. Bonnie and Erline were both practicing members of that church. So if you don't know anything about the Seventh-day Adventist, I'll give you a real quick overview. A general overview of their beliefs. And please, if I get something wrong, it is not intentional. I tried to find as many sources as I could to get a most accurate information. So from what I understand, they believe that the Bible is the literal word of God and that Jesus is the emissary of the great creator. The Trinity, which are the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are very important, with each having a defined separate role, but a singular goal of happiness and salvation for the human race. So God's the architect, Jesus sent to earth to help the humans follow God's plans, and the Holy Spirit take directives from Jesus to assist in the creation and salvation, of the universe. They also don't believe that you can be saved by your actions or your deeds on the earth. Your salvation is solely a gift from God, and the only way to be saved is through faith and grace. And the laws that are meant to be followed are God's laws, not man's laws, not government's laws, God's laws. But normally they do follow laws and commandments because that is considered doing good, and that leads to grace and ultimately to salvation. Also, Seventh-day Adventists don't believe that there's someone upstairs that's keeping score. So while you should avoid your bad deeds, if you have enough faith, you'll still be gifted salvation. They believe that they're already saved and that they follow the commandments because it is God's will. But they also believe in the end of days. They are an end of days religious group. And they believe that Jesus will come back to earth and judge and save those that have followed faithfully and bring them back up to heaven. They believe in the signs and the symbols, war, famine, disease, earthquakes, floods. And they believe that these foretell the return of Jesus to the earth. And then he will bring the good and the faithful back to the promised kingdom and their promised reward. Most lead extremely healthy lifestyles, believing that their bodies are temples and gifts. And they don't believe in alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, because those things destroy the temple that they have been gifted. And also in believing that the Bible is the literal word of God. It cannot, and it is not open to interpretation unless you are a prophet or a Messiah.
Sowing them seeds already.
I was gonna say little footnote there. By the way, we totally would have been kicked out like 3 sentences ago.
Oh my God. Are you kidding me? I absolutely would have been kicked out.
All the fireball that we shoot after investigations. See ya.
So I was taken to one time. My dad saw like this end of days like sermon flyer and took me and my mom to the Seventh-day Adventist church one night. I remember it was on a Saturday because they do attend church on Saturdays as well.
Yes, it is. Saturday is their Sabbath.
And we went, and they were very nice, but they were also very like fire and brimstone. This is the end of days. Here's this chart. Here's what the beast is going to look like. Here, like they were very like, you are living right now in the apocalypse. The apocalypse is coming. It's around the corner.
And they do believe that you are always under the influence of good and evil, and that something is always coming to tempt you and to test you, and you must be stronger than that. So,
well, if it's around the damn corner, then I'm just going to fudge my car note next month. I mean, shit.
Allegedly.
I would recommend you not do that.
Allegedly, I forget we're being recorded. Allegedly.
So, anyway, back to the story.
Go down in a blaze of glory, baby. No.
That is a very poor choice of words for this episode.
Oh, right.
Oh, wait. Oh, no.
Continuing on.
That's foreshadowing, people.
Continuing on. Vernon Bunnell, he had memorized the entire Bible, cover to cover. And he would often challenge his teachers in his Seventh-day Adventist school on how they were teaching. He would recite text and apply them in creative new ways, and he would adapt them to the people that he spoke to. He had the uncanny knack to talk about the Bible in ways that people could understand, that they could relate to. And his energy and magnetic charm and charisma, they just kept growing to the point of being arrogant. Deemed a disruption, he was asked to leave the academy, and he moved back in with Grandma Erline, who had moved again, and this time to Chandler, Texas. And with this last move, Vernon just dropped out of school entirely. Didn't feel wanted. He'd been kicked out of every school he'd gone to. He was a man now, without a high school degree and with very little prospects, and he began to search for purpose. He picked up carpenter work, but he couldn't seem to hold a steady job. He bounced between Dallas and Chandler and East Texas. And during this low point in his life, he really had no permanent residence. So when he was 18 or 19, he ended up getting a 15 or 16, depending on what you read, 15 or 16-year-old girl from Dallas named Lisa Campion pregnant.
Mm.
Oh, and he had sinned. He had premarital sex, and now he believed that he should marry her. Based on his beliefs, because they had sex, they were already married in the eyes of God, and he needed to do the right thing. So he went back to her, and she told him she got rid of the baby. But the attraction between Vernon and Linda was very real. And strangely enough, Linda's parents allowed Vernon to move in with them, to stay in their house and sleep in the same bed as their daughter. The romance seemed to be parent approved. So Vernon's belief that they were married because of the sexual activity somehow, through this weird, strange little moment in time, became cemented in his head that they were already spiritually married. And soon enough, Linda was pregnant again. And when her parents found out, they were furious. They ran him off and made sure he was never part of Linda or the child's life. Now, doesn't that seem like kind of a mixed message?
Yeah, they let him stay, and they knew
Yeah.
what was happening. This
Yeah.
makes no sense.
That was one of like kind of like, what did you exactly expect to happen?
I mean, you set up
Right.
the situation.
Yeah.
I mean, what did you expect? I mean, he's a
Yeah.
young man. She's a young woman. You know, I mean, come on, like.
But you're talking 18, 19, and 15 or 16. Now, that's not a huge age difference, but that's just enough to get you into trouble.
Yeah.
And the parents seem to be okay with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
after the first time, it seems like they would just, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, poor choices, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So whenever he got run out of Linda's life, he decided to live with his aunt / sister for a while. During the time, during this time, he claimed to have a vision from God that showed him two walls. One had the word law on it, and the other had the word prophecy. He went to his aunt and asked, "Why are there no more prophets?" And she told him that she had heard that there were still prophets and that they were living on a compound in Waco, Texas.
Hmm.
Well, still searching for purpose and in need of a change, Vernon traveled to Los Angeles to try to become a singer, a rock star. But he failed miserably, like most do. And Vernon realized that he was a better preacher than a musician. He knew his doctrine had a more radical approach to Christianity, but he was certain of his true calling, and he returned back to Chandler and to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He attended and committed himself to the church on a scale that even he himself had never seen before. And the church welcomed him. They listened to him grieve about his inability to be part of his child's life. And he appeared to be a flawed but religious man who was looking for guidance. And over time, he changed. He became an arrogant rule hawk, quick to correct those in the congregations for their actions. And his motives seemed pure. And at that point, he was still kind of keeping a lid on his creative liberties that he tended to take whenever he spoke about religion. And he began to use his religious knowledge to impress the good church-going women, like to flirt a little bit.
Mhm.
But as always, he fell for the wrong girl, the pastor's daughter.
Oh shit.
Don't do it,
Vernon,
people.
yeah. Vernon walked up to the pastor and announced to him that God wanted him to have his daughter as a wife. And the pastor promptly kicked him out of the church.
Ah, thank you.
I was gonna say,
Thank
I'm
you.
sure that went over like a lead balloon.
Yeah. Because I'd have done the same damn thing.
Yeah.
That's some balls, isn't it? God wants
Yeah.
me to have your daughter as a wife.
Yeah.
You can kick rocks, you ass.
Yeah, get the hell
Yeah.
out of here.
So Vernon went back to his aunt / sister, and they decided that they were going to start attending these revelation seminars put on by an evangelist named James Gilley in Arlington, Texas. They depicted dramatic portrayals of Armageddon, cleverly mixed with current day events over the written words and revelations. And Vernon immediately he connected with this message. And Vernon decided to enlighten the Seventh-day Adventist in Tyler, Texas. His sister / aunt said that he was convinced that it is time to have a new prophet and a new light in the Seventh-day Adventist church. That is what he's told her. And the church, however, they didn't exactly go for the idea and basically told Vernon to kick rocks and kicked him out of that church as well.
Sorry, I'm over here cracking up every time you're like sister slash aunt, sister slash aunt, sister slash aunt. Like I know, I know where you're going with it, but if somebody's just now jumping into the broadcast, they're gonna be like, "Wait a minute."
Yeah. Well, this was the moment that actually changed Vernon's destiny. Vernon set out to find that group, the group that might be more receptive to his message, and he sought refuge with the reclusive group of back to basic Christians that had lived in Waco since 1920. The group was a distant cousin to the Seventh-day Adventist, and they shared many of the same ideas that Vernon had, and they called themselves the Branch Davidians. The original Davidians were a self-sustaining group who had believed that contact with the outside world was harmful, and they ran their own school, grew their own food, treated their own sick, and they ran their own community. They had survived even through the Great Depression. The Branch Davidians in Waco were a splinter sect of that organization that was kind of formed in 1955 and was led by Ben Roden. In 1973, Ben had bought 77 acres of the original Davidian land and had called the property Mount Carmel. In 1977, he made his wife Lois co-president of the group. And this group did follow an end of days belief system, and there was much more value given to prophecies and visions in end of days sects.
Mm-hmm.
And now when Ben passed away in 1978, Lois became the leader of the sect. And she said that she had had a vision that the Holy Spirit deity was not male, but it was feminine. It was a female entity. And the followers kind of seemed eager to accept this new vision. And the community flourished. And the devout appeared to be extremely happy in their own little piece of paradise. But their Garden of Eden was about to have a snake slither through the gates. And in 1981, Vernon Howell stumbled upon the property. He was newly 21 and searching for a shortcut to a leadership role. And the Branch Davidians welcomed him in. And almost immediately, Vernon noticed that there was a power struggle brewing between Lois and her son, George. George Roden believed that he was the rightful successor to lead the Branch Davidians and wanted to oust his mother so he could take control and do things his way. But Lois had not yet named her heir to the leadership position, and it was pissing George off. So while Vernon genuinely admired Lois, he saw an opportunity. He became very close to her, never far from her side. He hung on her every word and prophecy that she shared. He did everything he could for her and became her right-hand man. And before long, he was spotted sneaking in and out of her room at all hours of the day and night.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, she was 60. He was 21. Get it, Lois?
Harold Maude.
Shelly said, "Get it, Lois." Jesus, Shelly.
Good Lord.
Now, later, Vernon would say that they were hoping for a miracle conception, like the story of Sarah and Abraham in the Bible. And if you don't know the story, Sarah had a child when she was 90 with Abraham, a son. So that's what they were, fingers crossed. So while Vernon was gaining the confidence of the most powerful person in the group, he was screwing up George's plans. Most of the Branch Davidians didn't trust George, and the members viewed him as an overgrown child that was prone to temper tantrums and stomping about. Lois had been a good and trusted leader and had done really good things for the group. So George's bid for the leadership role wasn't really taken seriously. She began to let Vernon preach and conduct worship services. And everyone seemed to be enamored with Vernon's charisma and his ability to put people at ease. And Vernon began to tell the faithful about his visions and his prophecies. And the people responded to Vernon in a way that they had never responded to George. And in 1983, Lois declared Vernon her successor. And George was upset. This kid was hooking up with his mama, claiming prophecy, and preaching in his temples, or his meeting houses, his worship spaces. So George decided he'd go to the police and tell them that Vernon had taken advantage of his elderly mother. Okay, everybody was over 21. Police couldn't really do a whole lot about that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And he had followers that, and he told followers that Vernon Howell was sent by the devil to test their faith. And he began placing pictures of Vernon all over the compound with the word devil written below it.
I'm sorry.
And George, yeah.
Like some high
Yeah.
school level stuff.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
He's gonna draw a mustache on his photos real quick. Just 1 second.
Here's some horns.
That's
Here's-
right.
Devil. Devil
And
you.
George
Black his
began the
tooth out.
whisper- Yeah, and George began the whisper campaign, warning the followers that Vernon had been sent to destroy them. So, sensing that Lois was still alive, and he didn't want to make trouble for Lois, and so Vernon Howell, he decided he'd load up and move to Palestine, Texas. And by the way, for every one of you people that I watch documentaries on, it's not Palestine. We're in Texas. It's Palestine. Just so you know, I want you to forever have the correct pronunciation.
Listen, Palestine's about an hour and a half from me. It is Palestine. I
It's
promise.
Palestine. So every time you hear them say Palestine, you know they're saying it wrong.
It is Palestine.
So he loaded up and moved to Palestine, Texas, along with a handful of followers that were equally ready to be rid of George Roden. But before Vernon left in 1984, he got married. She was a 14-year-old girl named Rachel Jones.
Oh God.
Oh man.
Now wait, this was not illegal, as the age of consent in Texas at the time was 14 until the 2000s. So
Ew.
icky, yes, but illegal, no. And she had her parents' consent.
Still, God Almighty.
Yuck. No, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he married with permission from her parents. And when she left Mount Carmel with Vernon, her brother, David, her sister, Michelle, and father, Harry, they all went with them. They were now followers of Vernon Howell and his teachings. And to be fair, life in Palestine wasn't great. The small group lived out of plywood boxes on 19.9 acres of land. And they stayed there for several years, regrouping, drawing followers, and planning their triumphant return to Mount Carmel. And during Vernon's self-imposed exile in Palestine, he traveled all over the world, Canada, England, Australia, and he recruited people along the way and convinced them to follow his teachings. He brought quite a few of them back to Texas. He was building his flock. Now, Lois, back at Mount Carmel, she was not happy that her protege had left, and she made numerous trips to Palestine to convince Vernon to return because, in all honesty, she didn't trust her son, and she wanted the group that had splintered to come back to the fold. Now, in November of 1986, unfortunately, Lois died, and George finally got what he wanted. He took over Mount Carmel and he renamed it Rodenville.
Wait.
What a dork.
We want the flock to come back. Come back to Rodenville.
It
Yeah,
sounds
right.
like it's rat infested, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
no.
He has like a cardboard Burger King crown. I am the king.
Yeah. Well,
A mayor
there weren't-
sash walking around.
Yeah. So in
Horrible choice in a name. Sorry.
in the newly named area
Rodenville.
of Rodenville, there weren't many people left to rule over. And in the months before Lois had died, the faithful had been slowly and quietly leaving. And most of them sought out Vernon Howell in Palestine, and they joined his group. And George, he couldn't stand it. His kingdom was being abandoned, and he wanted his subjects back. So George decided he had to do something big. Something that would prove once and for all who was the true prophet and who was the one who would lead Mount Carmel and the Branch Davidians, or excuse me, who would lead Rodenville and the Branch Davidians.
It's a game of mousetrap.
So he decided he would arrange a contest that would remove all doubt of who was the true prophet. The prophet chosen by God that deserved the right to preside over the group. And his idea was truly morbid.
Oh, Lord.
George challenged Vernon to basically a Lazarus challenge. He challenged him to raise the dead. And the rules were very simple. dig up a body and bring the person back to life. And whoever could perform the miracle was ordained by God to lead, thus removing all questions. Now, Vernon didn't think this was a good idea. In fact, he thought it was a little crazy. And yes, I see the irony in that statement, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But George was very eager to be the first to complete the task. And he dug up the corpse of a one-armed lady named Anna Hughes, who was buried on the community cemetery property. She'd been dead for about 20 years. And
Hello?
George told Vernon, I have my body. Do you have yours?
He says, hello, 911. There's some guy digging up one-armed people in the cemetery. Come arrest him. Then you win the competition.
What in the fuck knuckles is this?
What kind of fever dream is this?
I've got my body. Do you have yours? But Vernon did not take the bait. Instead, he went to the police and, just kind of asked them, hey, isn't it illegal to disinter a corpse? I'm just asking. So.
And say I know someone that did that. How fast could you arrest him?
Hypothetically.
Yeah.
And that's the way he posted. So, but let's be very clear. He didn't care that Anna Hughes had been dug up. He had a different motive. And his motive was to get the police to go and arrest George. And that way, he and his followers could return to Mount Carmel, where he could teach his beliefs. But, in 1980 small town Texas, the local police didn't just go charging into protective religious community, based on solely on accusations. They just didn't do that. So they told Vernon that he needed solid proof and evidence that their presence was actually necessary out there. They told him, get pictures and we can help you out. Now, one of Vernon's brothers-in-law, Sam, he still lived at Mount Carmel. So Vernon provided him with a camera and instructed him to get pictures. So the man snuck into the room where the casket was, and the casket was sitting there draped with the flag of Israel, and took as many pictures as he could, and he returned the camera to Vernon. So Vernon developed the pictures, and he gave them to the police, only to realize that he had photographed only the casket, not the body.
Yeah, I was going to say, you prove to me that there's something in there. Like,
moral of the story: know who you're hiring.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
References, people. References.
Mm-hmm.
So the police still had no actionable evidence. And they told Vernon there was nothing they could do unless he brought them pictures of flesh and bone. Just a casket wouldn't do it. They didn't know who was in there. It could be empty. They could go in just based on that. So Vernon had to try again. But by that time, the brother-in-law, Sam, had gotten into an argument with George Roden, and he had left the compound. So the only option left was for Vernon to go in and get the proof himself. Vernon spent the next 30 days preparing. He rounded up some guns and followers to infiltrate the compound. And the night of the mission, the group dressed in camouflage and painted their faces. Each of the 8 men were armed with a gun and a flashlight. And on November 2nd of 1987, just after midnight, the group rolled up to the property, jumped from their vehicles, and began running towards the compound. One man was given a camera with instructions, get a picture of the body. And he sprinted ahead of the armed group as they fanned out to cover him as he ran for the doors of the chapel where Anna's body had been placed. But as he entered the chapel, there was no casket. The body was gone. The dogs on the property had begun to bark, and they alerted George that he had company. George stepped out of his home, armed with a submachine gun, and the 8 men made a hasty retreat, but stayed close to the property. So he stepped out.
Damn.
Here we go.
Yeah, no shit.
Wow.
So they didn't have their proof, so they just kind of regrouped a little off the property, and they decided that when daylight came, they'd try again.
This is like the worst capture the flag game ever.
Right?
Pretty much.
It's like dorks with guns.
Yeah. So when daylight appeared, they were going to try again. But George, he was ready this time. He had armed whatever residents that were still living there with guns. And a fight ensued. There were several injuries, and George was shot in the arm. And now the cops could show up and legally enter the property. They arrested Vernon and his followers. The local papers reported and this is based on George Roden's account. The local papers reported that a terrorist party had attacked the religious compound. They got their information from George Roden, who had told them that the Palestine Liberation Army had attacked them in some sort of jihad. I find that hilarious.
Oh my God.
The Palestine Liberation
not
Army.
the Palestine, the Palestine Liberation
But when people
Army.
read it, they assumed it was the Palestine Liberation Army.
Right.
Oh my God.
Okay. So little George, he had him a little sense of humor there. And that's what the papers ran with. Now, Vernon and his buddies, they were charged with attempted murder. And it really looked like they were going down until George Roden unintentionally helped them out. He took the stand, which was the best thing he could have done for Vernon Howell. He admitted on the stand that he had dug up the corpse of Anna Hughes and that he had tried to resurrect her. He also said with a straight face and a solemn look that sometimes he would end his prayers and prayer services with in the name of George B. Roden. Amen.
Oh. It's like, has everybody in the story been hit in the head with a hammer? Like, what is going on?
So the jury ended up acquitting Vernon and his co-defendants because these nice people obviously weren't pretending to be Jesus.
No.
And they couldn't possibly have done anything with malicious intent. Some say some stories say he was acquitted, some say it was a mistrial. It's been either way, they got off on attempted murder charges.
How much of a dumbass you have to be, though, to get up on the stand and be like, I dug her up and George Roden, amen.
In the name of George B. Roden, amen.
It's me, I done it.
That's
It's
right.
me.
Now, during all this legal mess, something else had been discovered. The taxes on the Mount Carmel property hadn't been paid in 19 years.
Ooh.
Wow.
Well, now, while George was over there busy being George, his followers, Vernon and his followers, decided they would go pay the back taxes. And they retook the compound, evicting George.
Wow.
Damn.
So he was smart.
It's a bloodless
Smart.
coup.
Smart.
Smart.
Yeah. Big time bloodless coup. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the compound, under the leadership of George B. Roden, amen, had fallen into disrepair. Leave me alone. I'm telling this story.
Oh, sorry. You just threw my ass for a loop. I was not expecting that.
So during his leadership time, the compound had fallen into disrepair. But the exiled followers were so happy to be back that they went straight to work to rebuild their home. And they owed it all to Vernon, who had liberated them from George Roden. And they found Anna Hughes hidden in the mechanic's shed. It is not known if they reburied her or not.
I would hope so.
Now, in 1989, not quite done with old George yet. In 1989, George Roden killed a man with an axe, claiming that he was working as a spy for Vernon Howell. And George also insisted that the dead man was claiming to be the Messiah. So George was arrested, charged with murder, but he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he spent the rest of his days in a mental hospital in Big Spring, Texas. Where, side note, he escaped a couple times, but they got him back, so all was well.
What
Now, this man was a nut. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So while living in Palestine in 1986, Vernon had taken two more spiritual wives. 14-year-old Karen Doyle and 12-year-old Michelle Jones.
Oh, God.
God, dude.
His wife Rachel's younger sister.
Oh.
My God.
Sorry, I just got.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fucking gross.
Now in 1987, while still living in exile, he took three more wives. 17-year-old Robin Bunce, 16-year-old Nicole Gant, and 20-year-old Dana Okamoto. At 28, he had 6 wives, 5 of them under the age of 18. And he told his followers that he had a vision, a prophecy, that God had sanctioned every marriage, and that he had been given direction to take each girl and to create the house of David. God had told him to father 24 children who would become the 24 elders written about in the book of Revelations. And in the end of days, these children would rule by his side in the celestial kingdom. He used biblical passages to reinforce his actions. So why would the followers question him? They had come to believe that he was a prophet sent by God. And with his triumphant return to Mount Carmel, his 6 young wives, and his flock in tow, it is here that Vernon Howell began the metamorphosis into David Koresh. No longer desperate for power because he had it. He decided it was time for the people to begin to worship him. He believed that he was the Christ, not just a prophet. He was the Son of God. He had overcome the challenges laid at his feet and defeated the enemies of the righteous, and that therefore this must be God's will. He began to preach about the apocalypse, fire and brimstone, and the end of days. And let me be very clear. This is not something that bothered the followers. The followers were not afraid of this end of days talk. This was part of their belief system, and they were excited for it. They welcomed it. They looked forward to the signs of the end of the world because that was necessary for them to complete their celestial journey and return to their ultimate, place in the heavenly kingdom. But eventually the messages became darker. And as the messages became darker, so did Vernon. And it seemed he took pleasure in verbally humiliating his followers. He made them fear the outside world. He, let's say, brainwashed. He brainwashed them into thinking that the only path of salvation was through him. He was practicing this level of mind control, and it took a sinister turn in August of 1989. He had traveled to Pomona, California, and was staying with the Bunce family, one of his many wives' relatives, and conducting meetings there. And suddenly, if struck from a power above, Vernon cocked his head to the side and announced that he was receiving a vision, a message right now from God. And he called it the New Light Prophecy. Allegedly, God told Vernon he was the lamb that was spoken about in the book of Revelations. He would be the one to break the 7 seals and lead the world to salvation. And on the spot in that moment, David annulled the marriages of all the men in the group. Men from that point on would be celibate, and their reward would be their perfect mate in the heavenly kingdom. But they would have to give their earthly wives to him. Now, God had also told him that he was entitled to at least 140 wives. And all the women of the group now belonged to him because he needed to have as many children as possible because time was running out. Now, there were 2 new followers in attendance that day, Mark and Elizabeth Rowe. And Mark would later say that in that moment, Vernon's vision appeared to be contrived, maybe even practiced. Pretty much a poorly acted melodrama. And after relaying his message, Vernon turned to Mark and said, "How does it feel, Mark, knowing that I'm stuck with Elizabeth now?" He wanted the followers to believe that what he was doing wasn't his choice. It was God's. And who were they to question the Almighty? So he would often tell these followers that they were God's guinea pigs and that his lot was to procreate and their lot was to tolerate. And he would tell them, "I'd swap with you any day."
Yeah,
such a burden.
Yeah,
such
I
a
bet
burden
he
for me to
fucking
take
would.
Yeah. Such a burden for me to take all of your wives. Oh, man.
I'm sorry, but I'm sorry. Right there in that moment, it'd have been like, you have to give up your wife. I'd have been like, this has been a great ride. Yeah. We'll see you later.
And I'm gonna tell you, the men in the group didn't initially hand over their wives. Some people left after this revelation, and that meant that those that remained and they stayed, they if they questioned the prophecy, they were made to feel as if they were being selfish and putting themselves above the will of God. And Vernon told the followers that the sexual desire was a sin and that he was absorbing all that sin for everyone. You're welcome. And he was able to convince the followers that by sleeping with their wives, he was sacrificing himself for their salvation.
He's so put upon. Oh my
Shelley,
God.
Shelley, you're killing me tonight.
Sorry.
She said, I'm absorbing all the sin. You're welcome.
That's right. Now, this was even kind of a creepier part. This is something that rolled out of it, and I'm going to try to kind of speed this up. We're never going to get to the end of this thing.
Okay, good.
He had them convinced that you had to have sex with Vernon in order to go to heaven. And it wasn't just the adult women of the group. Some as young as 11.
God almighty.
And this was the breaking point for some members. But even if it was, there were still plenty of sexual targets at the compound. It is reported that young girls in the community, once they reached the age of puberty, they were given a plastic Star of David to wear. And this would signify that they were ready to bear the prophet's children and become members of the house of David. And each night he would make his selection.
God almighty.
Now, a young girl named Curie Jewel, whose mother was a member, had been given a star. And the girl's father, who was not a member, found out about the practice. Because a member of the group, fearing for her safety, now this wasn't her mother, this was another member of the group, warned David's father that Curie was in danger of being selected as one of the prophet's wives. His father immediately filed paperwork and fought for custody of his daughter. And he won. He had her removed. He removed Curie from Mount Carmel, and her mother stayed behind. Now, later, Curie would testify at the Waco hearings that she was 10 years old when she was forced to have sexual relations with David Koresh. She said she would stare at the ceiling and wait for it to just be over. And afterwards, she would hide in the shower for hours, this is really hard for me, sorry guys, trying really hard to wash the shame off her body and her soul. She would also later testify that the children were disciplined viciously and brutally, and they were constantly being told that the end of the world was coming and to be prepared. She and the other children lived in fear. Former member Grace Adams said that she so dreaded Vernon choosing her that one night she just decided she'd go to the door at 3 a.m., offer herself to him, and just get it over with. Vernon flew into a rage and he screamed at her that God made all of his sexual selections. He woke up everyone in the compound and he screamed at Grace in front of the group. Then he decided that she should be isolated and punished. He put her in an 8 by 10 foot room under 24-hour guard for 4 months. She was fed from a bowl on the floor. And when Vernon did come to her cell, he beat her, hit her repeatedly in the face. She begged to be allowed to leave, but he refused. However, when he learned that her visa was about to expire and the authorities might actually come looking for her, he relented, telling her that God said, "You can go now." And she left. And she went back to California, where she spent the next 2 weeks in a psychiatric hospital before going home to New Zealand. Her sister stayed behind at Mount Carmel, practicing and preparing for Armageddon. Now, in 1990, Vernon Wayne Howell legally changed his name to David Koresh for business and publicity reasons. His name, he took the name, it's a biblical reference to the second king of Israel, King David, from whom the next Messiah would descend, and the Persian ruler, King Cyrus the Great, that led the Jews from persecution. The Messiah had arrived, and the transformation was complete. This is the moment that this is purely my opinion, this is the moment that, in my opinion, where the group goes from fringe religious sect to cult.
Yeah.
The people that stayed after the polygamy and the adultery and the pedophilia had obviously completely bought into the teachings of the man that we're going to refer to from here on out as David Koresh. He told his followers that if the Bible is true, then I am Christ. And he wanted his followers to believe that this was a burden that had been put upon him. They blindly followed and accepted without question the man in front of them was the Messiah. Free will was an illusion. It wasn't the hand of God running the Branch Davidian cult. It was the fist of David Koresh. And while in charge, Koresh did make some improvements. George Roden had rented a cottage to people that had been using it as a meth lab. Koresh did call the cops and he had them removed. He motivated and coordinated the people to build the compound, to kind of, rebuild the compound by tearing down their own houses and recreational areas. And this multi-story compound was constructed, and it had a food storage area, a gym, a pool, a cafeteria, an auditorium, a kitchen, a computer room. The building also included a 4-story watchtower with a reinforced bunker below. And there was also a trap door that led to a buried school bus that was to be used as a fallout shelter. And it housed over 130 people at one time, with room still left to grow. They had large water towers and several fuel tanks, and they were a self-sustaining, well-stocked, and well-armed unit, just as the original Davidians had been. And the members had jobs outside the compound, and most of them tied 10 to 20% of their income to the group to contribute to the communal living. And the Branch Davidians under David Koresh seemed to be liked in the town of Waco. They ran their own businesses, including a seamstress shop, an auto body shop, and they also had a kind of firearm side hustle going that sold guns at local gun shows, all above board. And for a short time, all seemed to be running quite smoothly. But in quick order, there was another challenge to David's leadership. Remember Mark Bro? He was the guy who thought Koresh was faking his visions.
Mm-hmm.
He showed back up, and he began to publicly question Koresh and his teachings. But his motivation was transparent, and he was quickly kicked out and exiled from Mount Carmel for what David Koresh called immoral behavior. God, I wonder what that line was.
Yeah, right.
No shit.
Mm-hmm.
So Mark vowed to get revenge against David Koresh. And so he called in child abuse allegations and illegal firearm allegations to local law enforcement. Mark also began going to the press to give interviews about what was going on inside the walls of the compound. And he made reports to the Cult Awareness Network. When, if you don't know what that is literally a network where you can go and find out information about cults. They let people know, what to do if your kid is involved in a cult. He starts making reports to this group in an effort to disparage the group that he just tried to become the leader of. Now, the child abuse investigation allegations had to be investigated. There's no way around that. So social workers went on the compound, and they were going there to address the allegations. But they left finding no solid evidence of any wrongdoing. And the inquiry was officially closed on April 30th of 1992. Now, while CPS was still investigating, the ATF had officially begun an investigation into Koresh and had been asking around about him at local gun shops. Delivery man Larry Gilbreth had noticed packages with labels from arms dealers were being sent in large quantities to the Davidian compound. Now, in Texas, that was not illegal, but he wondered why there were so many.
Mm-hmm.
And the day a poorly sealed package fell from the shelf and a grenade rolled onto the floor of the delivery man's van, that is when Larry decided to give the authorities a heads up. He let them know that they might want to pay attention to that little group in Waco. Now, while the Davidians might have been able to satisfy the CPS investigation, the ATF wouldn't be so easily to shake. They were still licking their wounds from the botched Ruby Ridge siege 6 months earlier.
Yeah.
And the ATF needed a win. So they began collecting information about the group around the town and in the gun shops. But the owners had nothing bad to say about David and his followers. One owner even told David that, hey, Fed's been out here nosing around. Gave him the heads up. To which Koresh said, we have nothing to hide. And in a bold move, he invited the ATF to come out and look at their inventory and check their paperwork. The ATF never took him up on the offer. Instead, they rented a house close to the property and moved in 4 agents with nothing but surveillance gear. Now, the Davidians were pretty sure they were being spied on. Wanting to see if their suspicions were true, several members went to the cottage and just knocked on the door. They said they wanted to welcome them, and they brought them food. Then, just to be extra friendly, they invited them to attend a service at Mount Carmel.
Oh boy.
Now, this surprised agent who answered the door, he opened it only a crack and politely declined the invitation. Now, knowing for sure that they were being watched, David Koresh's paranoia became heightened. He decided that it would be a good time to do a television interview, and he chose an Australian-based TV program. He wanted to get his message across and control the narrative. He wanted the court of public opinion to be on his side if any action was taken against them. But instead of showing the wonderful buildings and the happy dwellers of Mount Carmel, he used the time to tell the world about how he'd been whomped for doing something wrong when he got bad grades when he was a child. And that when he grew up, he had decided he would do it differently. And that they were doing it differently at Mount Carmel. The interviewer finally flat out asked him if he had guns. And Koresh admitted that they did. And then he ranted that in America, the government was trying to take away guns. And I'm quoting him here, "It is nobody's business if we have guns." And in this strangely prophetic interview, David says, "He's got guns. That makes him bad. That makes him a cult. You know, it's just a raw deal. In this touchy subject we're dealing with, they come here with a gun and start shooting us. What would you do? Tell me. Be realistic." Now, the interview proved to be very ineffective. Instead of putting the public's mind at ease, the public began to wonder if there was a madman in Waco. And not long after, a junior ATF agent named Robert Rodriguez strolled onto the property, pretending to be a college student, and asked to speak to Koresh. He was trying to infiltrate the cult. David suspected that he was law enforcement, but he welcomed him in. He met with him. Rodriguez continued to return to the property and came for prayer sessions and sermons. And less than 2 weeks before the siege, Koresh was at a shooting range with 3 ATF agents on the property, showing off his skills, his shooting abilities, and his arsenal. Koresh was upping the stakes. He would mock agents by jogging every day along the path that passed directly in front of the little rented house the agents were stationed inside, almost daring them to step out and arrest him. David would also make regular trips to town alone, slowly driving by the cottage, just to see if they would stop him. But the ATF didn't want Koresh alone. They wanted the weapons and the witnesses to what had been reported. And finally, they went to the judge to seek a warrant in 1993 to go into the compound by force. Due to the child, they said it was due to the child abuse allegations made by Mark Bro. Now, let's be very clear. The ATF does not have jurisdiction over child abuse cases. Those fall under the jurisdiction of Child Protective Services. So, and the allegations of illegal weapons, those came from the footage shown on the interview conducted by the Australian TV interviewer.
Mm-hmm.
The ATF also alleged that there were illegal anti-tank guns, which were known as elephant guns, on the property. So based on this, the judge granted a knock search warrant. So there's a knock warrant and no knock warrant. No knock warrant means you go in guns ablaze and do whatever you need to do. Now, knock warrant means you literally have to knock on the door, "Hey, police."
Right.
So the ATF began their plans for a swift and dynamic entry that they estimated would probably take only about 20 minutes. They spent 3 days preparing for the raid on Mount Carmel. They did know that the group was heavily armed, and they were trained to use the weapons that were inside the building. And the ATF, they weren't going to take any chances. The raid mission support system consisted of 10 Bradley tanks, 2 Abrams tanks, 2 Bell OH-58A helicopters. Sorry, I had to get all those words in there. A Black Hawk helicopter, 4 combat engineering vehicles, 668 agents, 6 custom agents, 15 U.S. Army personnel, 13 National Guardsmen, 31 Texas Rangers, 131 Texas Department of Public Safety's officers, 17 McLennan County Sheriff's officers, and 18 Waco police officers, equaling 899 people in total to conduct a raid that was estimated to take 20 minutes.
Jesus Christ. They brought a small army.
Damn.
That's insane.
Okay,
that's a massive amount of firepower.
I knew that it was a large group, but I didn't even think it was that fucking close.
Yeah,
it was big.
Like, holy shit.
Now, the raid was planned for March 1st, 1993.
Mm-hmm.
But here comes Mark Grow again. And he was telling his story to the Waco Tribune Herald. And the paper was planning on putting together a 3-part series and releasing it called The Sinful Messiah. And this included a call to action for local authorities to go out and handle that cult problem. Part 1 was scheduled to print on February 24th of 1993. Now, the ATF tried to get the paper to hold off on the article. And when the paper asked for a reason, they were only told that the ATF couldn't discuss their current dealings and strategies concerning Mount Carmel, but they would really appreciate their cooperation. So the Waco Tribune Herald went to press with the story on February 27th of 1993. The ATF, feeling that their backs were against the wall, they ordered the raid for the next morning, February 28th, 1993. Higher ups in the ATF chose to alert the press to the impending raid. They wanted to highlight their show of force in an effort to dissuade other radical groups considering illegal undertakings. They didn't give a specific time for the raid, just the date. And while many mistakes were made, this is arguably the most impactful. An overeager journalist looking to get the scoop was feverishly driving around the back roads of Waco trying to find the compound. Worried that he was going to miss out on the action, he flagged down a mailman making his early morning rounds. The reporter explained that he was looking for the Branch Davidian compound and he was lost. Oh, the mailman gave the reporter directions and then he asked, "Hey, why you headed out there?" The reporter eagerly told him that he had been tipped off by law enforcement there was going to be a raid and he had to get out there to cover the story. And with that, he drove away. The mailman's name was David Jones, David Koresh's brother-in-law.
Oh, God.
Oh, shit.
David Jones headed straight home to warn the 130 people inside the walls of Mount Carmel, a full 45 minutes before the ATF arrived. They had lost the element of surprise. Robert Rodriguez, the undercover agent, was in the compound when David Jones ran in to warn them. Rodriguez was actually with David Koresh having a normal conversation, and David Jones scurried into the room and, in a very animated fashion, warned them that the ATF was coming, that they were about to be raided. Rodriguez stated that Koresh became frantic and panicked, and Koresh looked at his ATF friend and said, "Robert, they're coming for me. I know it. This is it." Rodriguez headed for the front door with the excuse that he'd already made breakfast plans and he had to go. And he recalled in his testimony that he expected as he walked away to be shot in the back, and that his whole body shook as he opened the car door. He was hyper alert for any sounds that signaled danger, and he had to use his left hand to steady his right as he put the key into the ignition. He started the car and he drove away from the compound. And once out of sight, Robert sped to the ATF spy house to tell them to call off the raid. The Davidians knew they were coming. The mission had been compromised. They were depending on the element of surprise, and now their advantage was gone. The ATF couldn't go in. The 4-story watchtower gave the Davidians an advantage that, over those flat plains surrounding the compound, and they were very well armed. The officers would be sitting ducks if they stuck with the current plan. But the higher-ups wouldn't call it off. Or they couldn't call it off. The ATF officials told the officers to write their blood types on their neck and their arms before they left the staging area that morning for Operation Trojan Horse. And at 8 a.m. on February the 28th, 1993, they loaded up 2 cattle trailers full of heavily armed agents and made their way to Mount Carmel. And as they rattled down the path to Mount Carmel, 3 helicopters approached from the rear. The first part of the mission was to neutralize the compound's dogs. And as the operation began, David stepped out of the front door of the compound calling, "Stop! There are women and children in here." And immediately gunfire erupted. Now, to this day, no one is sure exactly where the first shot originated. Most likely, according to the Waco investigation in 1995, the shots that were heard came from the team that were neutralizing the dogs. Now, immediate chaos ensued. The ATF fired, the Davidians fired, the helicopters fired. Agents using ladders swarmed in and tried to make entry on the second floor of the building. Members of the Branch Davidians were calling 911, begging for help, and that the raid had to be stopped. More gunfire was exchanged until finally the ATF agents were forced to retreat. The initial gun battle lasted 2 hours and only ceased when the ATF ran out of ammunition.
Jesus.
Damn.
4 ATF agents were killed, more than 20 were injured. 6 Branch Davidians died, but that number would keep rising. And the leader, David Koresh, he had been shot in the side. And now, because there had been loss of life of federal agents, that meant that the FBI now had jurisdiction on the operation.
Yep.
And they laid claim. That night, the FBI moved in with the hostage crisis negotiation team, say that 3 times fast, to take over the operation in Waco. And the FBI wasn't playing. And thus began 51 days of fear. And soon after the 911 calls began, it became apparent that there were 2 leaders in the Branch Davidians, David Koresh and his right-hand man, Steve Schneider. Koresh and Schneider had this strange little unique relationship. Koresh had fathered a child with Steve's wife, Judy. But Schneider was the only man in the cult allowed to keep having sex with his own wife. Don't know exactly what all that about, but that was the relationship. So whenever all this happened, no one knew exactly what to expect or do. Something like this had never happened before. There was no roadmap, no plan, no exit strategy, nothing on the table. But the negotiations did begin almost immediately. The negotiators' goal was to get everyone out without further loss of life. But even more important to him was to get the children out. And the talk started off pretty rocky. David ranted and raved and preached to him, but eventually there was an uneasy trust developed between him and the hostage negotiators. During the conversations, the FBI were able to establish a wiretap on the line. And this is how they found out that the Davidians were making calls to local media outlets. So to control the flow of information, the FBI cut the phone lines and routed all the outgoing calls directly to the negotiators to ensure that the media wouldn't muck things up any further. And they were moved to an encampment 2 miles away where they were allowed to cover the story from there. And as tensions cooled, the negotiations began, and Koresh told the negotiators that if his message was allowed to be played on KRLD News Radio 1080, a radio station out of Dallas, that he would allow children to be released 2 by 2 each time it aired. It was played twice that day, and true to his word, 2 children were released each time. The next day, the broadcast was played 5 more times, and 10 more children were released. On March 2nd of 1993, Koresh sent out another cassette tape to be played the next day during prime time. 2 more children and 2 elderly women were released later that day, but the women were immediately arrested outside the compound. On March 3rd, 1:30 and 2:30, the messages played again. David also caught a CNN broadcast that made them aware of the arrest of the women. Koresh gathered a group into the meeting area for prayer and told them that God had now told them they would have to wait. The FBI negotiators convinced the U.S. Attorney's Office to drop the charges on the women and only hold them as material witnesses as a sign of goodwill. So they did. But the goodwill was almost immediately undone. Soon after, the FBI used tanks to destroy cars and go-karts and bikes outside the compound. Now, the negotiators from the beginning were fighting an uphill battle. Unable to deter the directives of the FBI, the negotiators worked feverishly, and then David proposed another offer. If he could hold a Bible study without interruption, he would release another child. The negotiators agreed, and the little boy, Mark Jones, was released. Mark's little sister, Heather Jones, was released 2 days later on March the 5th. And no one knew it at the time, but Heather would be the last child. Heather would be the last child to escape the compound. Koresh requested a suture kit for his wounds and 6 gallons of milk for the remaining children. And he released a video of the remaining children in the building. All requests were granted. And then the negotiations devolved after that. Each phone call turned into biblical rants and sermons about the seven seals of the apocalypse. And Koresh said it was up to the people if they wanted to leave. Now, 12 adults did leave over the next 18 days, and all 12 were charged with conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of the 4 ATF agents and the 6 Branch Davidians that died on that first day. And now Koresh began to make demands. He instructed that the tanks be removed and he'd be allowed to speak to the media. But his instructions fell on deaf ears. Koresh tried to barter that if he could speak to his friend Robert Rodriguez, the undercover FBI agent, that he would release 6-year-old Melissa Morrison. But he was told that Robert was no longer in Waco, and allegedly no attempt was made to get him back. Little Melissa would die in the compound. Sorry, I have a problem with that. On March 7th and 8th, over 11 hours, 42 calls occurred. Koresh said that if the negotiators could show him the third seal, that he would release more children. Now, the agents did their damnedest to understand and comply, but Koresh was unsatisfied with the interpretation on the other end of the line. Member Wayne Martin wanted to speak to the press and arrange a lawyer and told the negotiators that he wanted to press charges against the government. So, of course, his request was denied. Kathy Schroeder was willing to come out, but only if she wouldn't be separated from her children and sent to jail. Also a no. Now, Koresh at this time was fed up with the FBI investigators and asked to speak to the Waco sheriff, who he knew personally. And during the chat, he promised that he wouldn't commit suicide. Come on now, you know me. And he negotiated more milk be delivered, and he even sent out money to pay for the items. On day 10 at 2 a.m., the power was cut to the compound. Koresh got on the phone to negotiators and told them that they relied on the power to listen to the daily press conferences. And if the power wasn't restored, then he was done talking for good. And the power was restored later that day. Go ahead, Blake.
I was just going to tell you that we've got some interesting comments coming up in the thread, that there is a gentleman in the comments who says that his father, Donald Buns, was apprehended by the ATF that morning, and his sister-in-law was one of the sister was one of the wives. Mark Jones, that you just mentioned, is his sister-in-law's son, and that they could actually not by definition reveal the third seal.
Wow. Thank you. That is a wonderful comment. I appreciate that, sir. Thank you very much. And
wow.
I'm sorry for your tragic loss and loss of your family about this. And please, if you know, sir, if there's anything in the comments that I get wrong, please put it in there. I compiled a lot of sources to bring the story to you. So the power was restored the next day. A radio program the Davidians were listening to suggested that, hey, if you need something, hang a banner out the window. And later that day, a large sheet was hung out the window on the compound that said, God help us, we want the press. 2 days later, Kathy Schroeder left the compound to be reunited with her children. And she was allowed to call the compound and assure them that not everyone leaving was being arrested. Another member left that same day. Then the negotiations almost came to a halt when Koresh found out that his mother, Bonnie Sue Haldeman, had been offered $75,000 for her life story. Now, the FBI was fed up with the outside distractions. They decided that day, against the advice of the negotiators, that the power would be cut that night for good. The decision was based partly on the weather. It was going to be the coldest night forecasted that week, and the FBI wanted to freeze the Davidians out. In order to keep a light and a little heat on, the Davidians distributed gas cans and gas lights throughout the compound. A gas-powered generator was also used to sporadically light certain areas of the compound. And then the psychological warfare began. Large lights were set up to shine in the compound, and speakers blared loud music. Negotiators were not allowed to call the compound. They were only allowed to speak with the Davidians if they chose to call out. More lights were added. More terrible, ear-piercing noises were added. And the most recently departed adults called the compound under the supervision of the FBI to encourage the members to please just come out. Tanks began to bulldoze materials around the compound, including the fuel tanks and the wood piles. On day 20, Koresh finally returned to the phone, assuring the negotiations and the negotiators that he wasn't going to kill himself yet again, and ordered, don't destroy any more of our property. And Koresh also said, and I'm going to quote here, there was a new moon coming, and that they would be coming out, but he needed more time. That day, they also received a copy of the ATF search warrant that had been requested. Later that day, 2 men left the compound, and that's part of the 12 people that came out. So the FBI agreed to turn off the speakers for the day so the Davidians could observe the Sabbath, and that was their sign of goodwill. And the next day, 4 women left the compound. However, the FBI determined they needed a clearer view of the building, so they decided that they would clear vehicles from around the compound. And again, the negotiators objected because it was just going to harm any trust they had just established. And Koresh was finally talking again. It was a vicious pattern. Go ahead.
According to the comments, new moons are holy days for the Branch Davidians.
Thank you, because I did not understand that. Thank you.
That's probably what he meant by that quote that you just read.
Thank you, because not being someone who understands the faith, I did not know what that meant. Thank you very much, sir. So the FBI agreed to turn off the speakers for the day so the Davidians could observe the Sabbath as a sign of goodwill. And the next day, 4 women did leave the compound. However, the FBI determined they needed a clearer view of the building. So they decided they would clear the vehicles, and the negotiators objected. And this was a vicious pattern that was emerging. A letter was sent into Koresh that stated that if he would just come out, they would be allowed to continue to teach the followers, even if they were incarcerated. But Koresh was having none of it, and he tossed the letter out. On March 23rd and 24th, March 23rd, the 24th day of the siege, Koresh was worried about what the FBI and the ATF would do to him. So a man named Livingstone Fagan was sent, Livingstone Fagan was sent out of the compound. And David instructed Fagan that he was to bear witness to whatever happened. And he would be the last Branch Davidian to walk out of that compound. Steve Schneider at that point began to take phone calls. And he got on the phone with the negotiators and said, if their bosses hadn't done all the negative things, then they would probably have already come out. And now they might as well just come in and take his carcass out of there. The FBI began to use the press as a weapon, calling Koresh a coward that hid behind children, a religious fanatic who had been keeping up, Now, there was a religious fanatic as well who had been keeping up with the melee. His name was Louis Alamaze, and I believe I'm saying that right. He jumped the fence and snuck past all the guards and the TV cameras and the agents, and he went directly up to the door of the compound, and he knocked, asking to be let in. And he was. When Steve Schneider was told to send him back out, Steve refused. Come and get him. Then they demanded, now the FBI is over it. The FBI demanded that 10 people be released. And Steve Schneider told the agent, these people don't care. You can kill us, whatever. These people fear God, not you. And that is a direct quote. The deadline passed again without a single person coming out. And the tanks were sent back in to remove trees and cars from around the front of the building. With an ominous undertone, the FBI told Schneider that now no one would be allowed to leave the compound. Getting people out was no longer the priority, and ending this mess was. Another religious fanatic from California named Jesse Amons humiliated the authorities yet again by sneaking onto the property and entering the building. And again, the FBI demanded to be sent back out, but they couldn't contact the Davidians. Later, the Davidians hung a sheet out the window that said, "Tanks broke phone line." So once the phone line was repaired, they again demanded the release of 10 people. And again, the deadline was ignored. So a fence was torn down. Steve Schneider was back on the phone with the negotiators that day. He told them he didn't even care about the property damage anymore. He was going beyond this world. He even threatened that if the Davidians had wanted to kill the ATF agents, they could have done it at any time. The FBI could burn the compound down or kill them. He didn't care. And that is a quote from him from the hostage negotiator's tapes. Oddly prophetic. So several more fanatics did try to sneak in, but finally the authorities were ready, and they wised up and they arrested all of them. And on March 29th, lawyer Dick DeGuerin was allowed to approach the front of the door of the compound and speak to Koresh. And he would return the following 2 days and enter the compound to meet with his new clients. April 1st, DeGuerin returned with another lawyer who had been hired by the family of Steve Schneider. And when the lawyers entered the inner sanctum, when the lawyers left the inner sanctum, they were questioned by the FBI. The lawyers assured the authorities that the Davidians were going to come out after they observed their Passover, but it was unknown exactly when that would be. And they had also informed their clients, don't speak any further with law enforcement officials. April 4th, the lawyers went back in, and they were questioned again when they left. They still didn't know when the Passover would be, but the Davidians were making a plan to exit. David would come out first, followed by the women and children, and then followed by the remaining members. And finally, the last out would be Steve Schneider. And after the lawyers departed, Jesse Amons, the guy who snuck on the property, he walked out of the compound. He decided he'd had enough, and he was promptly taken into custody. On April 6th, Steve Schneider, there's getting tongue-tied, this repetitive the alliteration.
That's okay.
On April 6th, Steve Schneider told the agents via phone that Passover would start that evening and last for 7 days. The FBI changed their tactics yet again and disrespected the group's holy days by blaring music throughout the night and throwing flashbang grenades at the building. Against their own negotiators' advice, the FBI, ATF, and Attorney General Reno devised a plan to gas the Davidians out of the building. Coincidentally, just 3 months earlier, in January of 1993, the use of CS gas was banned in warfare in the United Nations Chemical Weapons Ban that the U.S. signed. Contact remained scarce between the Davidians and the negotiators. And on April 9th, Steve Schneider called to complain that the men outside were flipping off and mooning the women inside and flashbanging anyone they could. And the negotiators apologized and tried to calm the tensions. April 10th, the compound was surrounded by razor wire to prevent anyone else from sneaking in and to contain the area. Steve Schneider was back on the phone to tell the negotiators that he never said when they were coming out. And technically, he was right. He'd only told his lawyer. April 12th, the gas plan was confirmed by those in charge of the operation. If the Davidians failed to come out as promised after their Passover ended on the 13th, then the FBI would be forced to force them out. April 13th, the last day of their Passover, Koresh refused to speak to his lawyer, Dick DeGuerin, and no one came out. April 14th, Koresh spoke with Dick DeGuerin and said that he would come out, but the terms had again changed. Now he was coming out after he finished the manuscript over the 7 seals of the apocalypse, and he thought it'd only take him about 2 weeks to complete. Later, he began a 5-hour preaching marathon with negotiators on the phone. The plan to gas the compound was escalated, and it was going to happen soon because the hostage negotiation team had been there too long. April 16th, in an effort to keep them in the loop, Dick DeGuerin reported to the negotiators that David was making progress on the manuscript, and he was allegedly already at the 2nd seal. Everybody calm down. April 17th, perhaps sensing that the shit was more than likely about to hit the proverbial fan, Louis Alanese, the fanatic that is stuck onto the compound, he finally snuck back out. And on April 18th, Janet Reno approved the CS gas assault plan. She gave the green light to end the siege and informed President Bill Clinton of the decision. The FBI removed the remaining Branch Davidians' cars from the property so the tanks could move freely during the operation. The FBI also sent in more milk and typewriter ribbon for David Koresh to continue to work on his manuscript. They were trying to give those inside a false sense of confidence. The team was not going to lose the element of the surprise this time. April 19th, at 6 a.m., the gas assault began. And y'all bear with me, I'm going to do my best to get through this.
You're fine.
The negotiators called in to explain what was happening and that they could still come out peacefully. Steve Schneider took the call, and he was so angry that he ripped the phone out of the wall and smashed it in the front door, making no further communication possible. The gas arrived in powdered form and was mixed with methylene chloride, also known as paint stripper. The concoction was highly flammable, and the tanks poked holes into strategic locations of the buildings, tearing down some walls in the process to disperse the gas. And for the next 6 hours, gas poured into the building. The Davidians shot at the tanks and tried to make Molotov cocktails with the gas that they still had, but their efforts were useless against the wall of tanks. The Davidians strapped on gas masks to protect themselves, but they were no help to the children inside because they were too big to seal effectively over their little faces. So the children were herded into the underground bunker, but there was no escape from the gas that permeated the building. The tanks began to tear down the walls, and suddenly fires erupted from 4 different corners of the building. The wind gave the fire the fuel it needed to turn the building into a massive inferno. The media and the world watched in horror as Mount Carmel burned. One woman leapt from a second-story window. An agent ran to pull her away from the building, the entire time screaming, "Where are the children? Tell me, where are the children?" She defiantly stared at him and refused to speak. And for a brief moment in the chaos, it was reported that 20 people were seen running from the right corner of the building. They were burned, but they were alive. Officially, it was reported that there were actually only 8. As difficult as the fire might have been to put out, when the firefighters arrived, they were not allowed to approach the building for their own safety. And when the fire burned itself out, the tanks pushed all of the debris into the center of the building, destroying valuable crime scene evidence. There was a total of 9 people that escaped the building that day. All were treated on the spot and arrested. 11 Branch Davidians were tried for murder, tried for conspiracy to murder ATF officials, and were all received between 5 and 40 years. 9 were convicted on lesser charges and served prison time. No Branch Davidian was ever charged with arson. Over the course of the 51-day standoff, there were 754 calls made between the authorities and the Branch Davidians. There were 5 major investigations into the Waco incident. The Justice Department blamed Koresh. The Treasury Department blamed the ATF. The ATF blamed the FBI. Congress and the $17 million independent review board were critical of both the ATF and the FBI. And on a side note, the guns that the ATF went in to confiscate that day were with cult member Paul Fata at a gun show that day. God,
wow.
God's
Jesus.
guns and government collided so violently that the effects are still being felt today. The Waco tragedy changed the way law enforcement reacts and responds to similar standoffs. Koresh's teachings were that the first Christ was the good Christ, the holy Christ, and he believed that he was now the new Christ. But he was a very bad Messiah who had a favorite sin: pedophilia. He fathered 12 to 15 children, some with girls as young as 11. 81 Branch Davidians died that day. 20 of them were children, all due to the madness of a single man. A man who thought himself to be God. And it begs the question, how do you negotiate with God? The 51-day standoff came to an end, not in a glorious rapture with the return of Christ, but in a hellish fire that could only have been the work of the devil. A devil that went by the name of David Koresh. Sorry, went a little long.
You're okay.
No,
I will.
you're fine.
I'm just going to say one comment that came up from the gentleman. He said, I'm not sure if any 11-year-old girls actually had children. Might want to verify that, but he does know maybe as young as 13.
Thank you. I will look. Again, in compiling, there are so many different stories
Yep,
and reports.
yep. Yeah.
Thank you. I will check that. Thank you for bringing it up so that somebody doesn't say, oh, they have that completely wrong. If I do, please put something in there and let me know.
Yeah.
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 I mean, such an awful story all the way around.
It's terrible.
There are no winners there.
No.
Period. Absolutely none.
It's one of those things that it's just one of those things that it was just handled completely the wrong way.
Exactly.
Nobody knew how to handle it.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
Well, and that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean,
Yeah.
it was the first time for something of this magnitude to absolutely take place that was just ended in such tragedy. But I mean, I'm sorry, but I'll go ahead and say this. I think the ATF, the FBI, whoever, and all that kind of shit, they took tactics that obviously did not fucking work.
No, they botched
That
the shit out of it.
Obviously, we're stupid and dumb. And why would you even do that? Because you have this divide that's happening at this point between the negotiators who are actually getting shit
They're making
done,
progress.
Yep,
Yes.
absolutely.
and the guys who want to go in and just get the shit over with because they're spending $1 million a day.
Yep, they were spending $1 million a day on the operation, and it was costing them money.
Anyway, it was almost like a dick measuring competition, you know.
It did.
Just
That's exactly.
yeah.
And it became a problem. It really became a problem when Steve Schneider started getting on that phone. Because David had always been willing to talk. David was the one saying, yes, we'll release him. Yes, you do this. We'll release somebody. We'll let somebody go. And I always thought it was interesting. He always used the word release because he's always said they were free to leave anytime they wanted to. But then why are you saying release?
That's an interesting point.
Exactly. And do we know that? Because we weren't inside the compound. They could have threatened to kill people.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm telling you is what was recorded on the, y'all, I've lived inside this man's head for the past 3 weeks. I've listened to his sermons, and I can tell you, I don't know how someone can fall under that kind of spell. It's beyond my scope of ability in the moment to imagine. I was never raised to believe blind dealing anything. I was never raised to be so dedicatedly faithful and not ask questions. I wasn't raised like that. So for me to have people who wouldn't ask questions and wouldn't think to say, hey, wait, this doesn't look right. I don't think this is for me. I don't understand that. And I don't have to, but.
Yeah. I mean, you have people who were indoctrinated because they were in it from the time they were kids, or they were in it from the time for however long they were involved. And then you also have people who cults prey upon that are desperate or in a low point in their life, and they're just looking for anything to believe, and they'll follow. And when they find whatever that is to believe, they will follow that person or that ideology till the ends of the earth.
Look at the last cult that we covered, Heaven's Gate. I mean, it's the same thing. The story, I saw so many parallels between that and this, I mean, the charm, the charisma, the being drawn to, and that, yes, it was this moving around and finding these people who needed a home, who were looking for a place to belong. I don't know. The gentleman in the comments said that he said that Steve would have only done what David would have told him to do. So may not necessarily been Steve getting on the phone so much as
I don't disagree with you, sir. I think that Steve was directed, but I think that Steve was probably a more forceful voice. While David was, and I've listened to some of these recordings, and David, while he would be forceful, Steve was angry. And what I listened to, Steve sounded angry.
It's a good cop, bad cop routine, is what it is.
Yes, thank you. I think you're right. I think that's what it was.
And let me say this, because this is something that I thought. I watched the Waco Siege documentary. We now listened to this. I have read up on a few articles preparing for this, and of course, living in Texas. I mean, it's something that we hear our entire lives. We have known about Waco since we were knee high to a grasshopper. Okay, so. My thing is this whole time in this is that you have to separate, in my opinion, the Branch Davidians from David Koresh. Exactly because right. David Koresh came in and
made that group
perverted the doctrine.
Yes.
Fucked it up. I mean, as expertly as I could put it,
Yeah.
I mean, the Branch Davidians in themselves, Shelley, you made a really good point about being raised that way and being taught that way, just following and believing in this way. We were not raised like that, but they were. And in their mind,
their beliefs are sacred to them. Yes.
That's what led them down this path. And the reason why nobody was leaving and all of this kind of stuff is that in their mind, they were following their prophet. They were listening to their prophet. They thought they would be protected because of their prophet. My opinion, David Koresh is a piece of shit. That's me.
Absolutely.
But you got to separate the Branch Davidians from David Koresh, because they were around long before him, and they're still around to this day.
And they believe that the word of God is infallible. And to them, if God is telling, if there's someone who is saying that they're God, and to them, they have deemed this person to be God in front of you, what he says goes, and they're going to follow that no matter what.
Let me tell you a little interesting side note.
Oh, Lord.
One of the men that was watching the compound burn that day.
Mm.
His name was Timothy McVeigh.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody recognize that name?
Yep.
Oklahoma City bombing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
He was interviewed
He was.
He sure
that
was.
day. Yeah.
Yes, he was. Also, another little side note, David Koresh's mother, Bonnie Sue Haldeman, would end up dying a tragic death as well. She was stabbed to death in her home by her sister Beverly, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Whoa.
Hmm.
And then my final little tidbit, and then we can give our final thoughts, is that David Koresh has a burial marker in a cemetery in Tyler, Texas. And Blake and I did go out there, and we did have some interesting stuff come through a spirit box. And it was not lost on me to be standing at a worldwide known cult leader's grave. There was some power there, standing there, a reverence for the history, a sorrow for the loss of life, and a want and need to understand why.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Final thoughts.
I think, Shelley, thank you first off for bringing this and powering through and giving us the story. I know that wasn't an easy one.
Anytime
to get
with
through.
kids, it's too hard.
I know.
Yeah.
But I think my final thoughts on all this is just kind of reiterating what I just said. At the end of the day, you have to split the two entities, David Koresh versus the Branch Davidians, because they are two different. That this is a one-off in this group's entire history, and they have a right to believe what they believe. And I think that all around this whole thing was handled like shit and screwed up from the freaking beginning. Well, actually not from the freaking beginning. I would say until the guys with the guns got their panties in a twist and decided that they needed to make way because they were spending $1 million a day. So I think this could have had a completely different outcome. I think we could have been to look at a different sort of history than the loss of life of this magnitude had it just been handled differently.
I'm with you on that. I think had they let the ATF agents, not ATF, but had they let the negotiators do their jobs, this could have come about peacefully, and it was on its way to doing so. But they wanted to save so much face because of Ruby Ridge and because of. They just want, like I said, it's just a dick measuring competition. We're the guys with the guns. We're the government agents. We're controlling this, and you're not controlling any of this. And we're just going to come in here, guns ablazing, and do whatever we want. That being said, I'm with you, David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. You do have to separate. David Koresh was a giant piece of shit, and I hate that he had to take all those people with him when he went, but. He's exactly where he needs to be.
Yeah. I agree.
Shelley, what say you?
To me, the blame falls squarely on the shoulders of David Koresh. He was the one stockpiling weapons. He was the one messing with little children. He gave people reasons to seek him out. I think that every bit of the blame lies with him. He was a power-hungry egomaniac that had a charming power of persuasion. And had none of those things ever been done, they never would have been looked at to even go into the compound. I think you want to trace back to original root, original sin. The snake in the garden is David Koresh. And while it was handled poorly, and there's plenty of blame to go around, you have to go with the leader because shit rolls downhill. So, Blake, why don't you tell them everything they need to know?
All right, let's pep it up for the last little bit here. Well, first and foremost, as the last couple of weeks that we've been doing, we got to give a couple of announcements and shout out to our previous guest, Nick Sarlo, hashtag sexy leg Sarlo, from Shadowhunters, Paranormal Investigation and Events, Nick Simons and Aaron G. Thompson for Netflix 28 Days Haunted, as well as Sir Sexy himself, owner of Broadhead Manor, Mr. Bill Walter. Make sure you check out the information for Spirits in the Spring taking place this Saturday, April 22nd in Broadhead, Wisconsin. If you watched our episodes last few weeks, you'll remember all the fun they're going to have. including amazing speakers like Nick Simons and Aaron Thompson, as well as Patty Negri, just to name a few. They'll be having a selfie challenge, the world's longest paranormal conga line, pictures with Megan from the new hit movie Megan, plus an investigation taking place at Broadhead Manor itself for a separate ticket purchase. Spirits in the Spring is a huge charity event with tickets only $10 with a food donation, $20 without, and it's all benefiting 2 separate food pantries. So make sure you go check out those that Paracon happening this Saturday. Also, May 12th and the 13th, we will be speaking at the West Tex Paracon in Ballinger, Texas. They've got over 10 amazing speakers, including John Zaffis, the Kling Brothers, Natalie Jones from Paraflix Paranormal Plus, as well as us and many others. We will also be doing a special screening of the ScareNetwork.tv original documentary Old Park that we were featured in, which is one of the craziest weekends we have had at the Old Park Hotel.
Hands down.
And at night, they're also going to be hosting investigations at the Old Park Hotel and the Old Runnels County Jail for both nights. And if that's not enough of us in person, on July 14th through the 16th, you can catch us in Kansas City, Missouri, speaking at Metacon. They have also got a great lineup of paranormal and metaphysical speakers, as well as 40 plus vendors and over 30,000 square feet of shopping, fun, and healing. A few more announcements. We're almost there. Bear with me. Tickets for another 2-night at the Old Park Hotel for a 2-night investigation with us are currently on sale. That is in October 6th and 7th. We're going to be opening up the Old Runnels County Jail across the street from that one. So you same price as the one in April if you came to that, but with 2 locations this time. And we do expect those to start going quick as they have just now started selling. So make sure go follow our Eventbrite page so you can be notified when tickets for events like that go on sale. Because when we have more money, we're going to be launching a lot more later this year. So we'll make sure we post all those links for those Paracons and the Eventbrite page and all that stuff later this week at some point on our Facebook page. So watch our Facebook page. Speaking of Facebook, make sure you're following us across all of our social media channels to stay up to date on all the exclusive content. I've got this down by now. This is like week 9, okay?
Yeah.
Exclusive content we have coming this year. We utilize different channels to promote different content. So if you're only on one channel, you're only getting a fraction of the content available. Find the Linktree link in the description of our episodes or in the About Me or Bio sections and be taken directly where you want to go, including not only our public events, but our Patreon page. With our Patreon page, it is just $5 a month, and you get just under 100 additional Patreon exclusive videos, including our pre- and post-broadcast, Paracon speaking events, first dibs of public event tickets, and up-to-date information on dates, times, and locations of where we will be or what we'll be doing, and we reveal everything on Patreon. It's a hoot and a half. We have too much fun. And as always, any questions, comments, or stories you'd like to share, those can be submitted to us at theevppod@gmail.com. That's THEEVPPOD@gmail.com.
Like, share, and subscribe. What, Brian?
Forgetting one thing. Tomorrow night, Our Haunted Lives on Paraflix.
That's right. Catch us on Paraflix Paranormal Plus.
Yes, of Our Haunted Lives with David Taylor and Christy Vampera. Yes, love her. Maybe did she wear the fangs with us? I can't remember, but she wears fangs. Anyway, thank you guys for watching Everything Vaguely Paranormal. I'm your host, Shelley Pruitt, and my co-host and partners in the paranormal, Mr. Blake Smith, Mr. Ryan Roberts, and of course, our fabulous producer, the fabulous Miss Brittany, in the green room back there pushing the buttons and making us look good. And I know that's a really hard job. So thank you for watching, and as always, we will see you next Tuesday.
Bye y'all.